Chapter 1. Across the Atlantic. In the hushed hours before dawn, when the world is still wrapped in shadows and only the faint light of distant stars shimmers upon the dark ocean, a small wooden vessel glides slowly across the Atlantic. It sails full and quiet, like great white wings against the endless sky. The ocean, deep and vast, breathes in gentle swells, lifting and lowering the ship in a rhythmic embrace that feels like a lullaby. And on its deck there are men, women, and children leaning on the rail, their eyes fixed on the horizon, hearts filled with a strange mix of fear and wonder. They have left behind the only homes they have ever known, places with familiar hills and rivers and streets where every corner holds a memory. And they have entrusted themselves to this fragile ship and this uncertain sea, moving toward a new world they cannot fully imagine, guided by nothing more than hope and the whispered promise of freedom, carried in the ocean breeze. Night and day they have watched the sky shift colors, silvery blue at midday, deep indigo at midnight, and they have felt the salt spray kiss their cheeks as they huddled together beneath coarse wool blankets to ward off the ocean's chill. The scent of damp wood and tar mingles with the sharp, clean temps of the sea air as lanterns swing gently on hooks, casting pools of golden light across tired faces. Some passengers murmur prayers into the dark, hands clasped and lips trembling. Others stare up at the glimmering constellations as if those distant sparks might show them the way. Occasionally, a baby whimpers and is hushed by a mother's gentle lullaby, and somewhere near the prow a sailor hums an old tune, low and steady, so soft it blends with the rhythm of the waves. The days stretch into one another, and the journey feels timeless, as if they have always been here, floating between worlds, suspended in this vast cradle of water and wind. Beneath the ship, dolphins sometimes leap and play, their graceful bodies flashing in the morning light like quicksilver, and above, seabirds wheel and cry, their voices sharp and fleeting, reminders of how close they are to shore even when all they see is ocean. The passengers dream of what lies ahead, fertile lands and forests dense with life, rivers they will name and homes they will build, and futures they will shape with their hands and their hearts. They whisper these dreams to one another under a sky scattered with clouds, their breaths misting in the cool air, their eyes reflecting the gentle gleam of the lanterns and the deeper gleam of longing. The ocean listens to their murmured hopes and carries them onward, rocking them like a mother with a sleeping child. Each swell and sigh of water a promise that they will arrive somewhere new, where the grass is green and the soil is rich and the morning light is full of possibility. Sometimes, when the winds die down and the sails hang slack and still, they look around at the great empty blue and feel the awe of their smallness and the weight of their choices. Yet they do not turn back. Every creak of the timbers and every ripple against the hull reminds them that they have already crossed a threshold that cannot be undone. And though fear and sadness trail them like shadows, there is a quiet fire glowing within their chests. A fire fed by the thought of what they might become on distant shores. They leave behind their pasts like footprints washed away by the tide, and together they lean into the steady hush of the waves, imagining the bright mornings that await them. Every mile they drift onward is a mile further from the known, a mile closer to something they cannot see but feel in their bones. And as they stand together on that wooden deck, surrounded by the endless ocean, they sense the grandeur of their journey, the fragility of their vessel, and the profound courage it takes to chase a dream across the sea. They do not speak of their doubts often, but they rise and fall with the ocean, their hearts lifting and settling with each gentle roll of the ship, and with each passing hour they grow more certain that this unknown land, these distant shores kissed by morning mist, will give them a chance to begin anew. They listen to the wind humming in the rigging and the low creak of the mast. They breathe deeply of the cool and salty air. They feel the soft breath of the ocean on their skin and the calm of knowing that all this time spent drifting through the mist will soon lead them to something real, something lasting, something they will one day call home. And so, as the ship glides onward across the sleeping sea, and the soft light of a new day begins to shimmer at the edge of the world, they close their eyes and let the rhythm of the waves soothe them into gentle slumber, secure in the knowledge that their hopes and dreams are safe upon these waves, carried forward by an ocean that whispers forever of new beginnings. Chapter 2. Quiet Colonial Days. As the gentle light of dawn spreads across the landscape like a soft golden veil, the world awakens slowly and tenderly, and in the sleepy colonial villages scattered across the countryside, life begins once again with a sense of quiet purpose and a rhythm that feels eternal. The mist that clung to the hillsides during the dark hours now melts into the pale glow of morning, revealing tidy wooden houses tucked between groves of oak and chestnut, their windows glinting with the first rays of the rising sun. Farmers, wrapped in warm woolen shawls against the lingering chill, step outside into the crisp morning air, breathing in the scent of damp soil and dew-soaked grass. As they look across their small plots of land with a feeling of gentle pride, they move with measured grace as they begin their work, their hands already familiar with the worn handles of hoes and scythes, the smooth wooden yokes balanced across their shoulders, and their boots sinking softly into the fertile earth. In these quiet hours, the only sounds are the soft rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of a creek winding through a meadow, and the occasional lowing of cattle stirring in their pastures, each sound weaving together into a sleepy melody that belongs to the morning itself. Along the nearby shores, tiny fishing boats, their wooden hulls gleaming with moisture, glide across glassy bays, where the water is so still it seems to hold the sky itself in its depths. And fishermen, their hands practiced and sure, tend their nets with care and patience. The faint splash of oars and the cry of seabirds overhead, blending into the tranquil hush. Children run barefoot along paths lined with wildflowers, their laughter like chimes carried on the light breeze, and smoke rises in gentle blue, tendrils from chimneys. As hearths are kindled and breakfast is prepared, the rich aroma of baking bread and stewing oats drifting through open doorways. The village green lies bathed in sunlight, grass shimmering with droplets that catch the light like tiny jewels, and here and there a horse grazes quietly, its tail flicking in slow, content arcs as the village breathes in the peace of the day before it truly begins. Every face bears the softness of habit and belonging, and every gesture reflects the simple rituals that mark the passing of time in these settled places. Hands reaching into baskets for eggs still warm from the nest, the careful straightening of laundry on a wooden rail, the gentle creak of a rocking chair as an elder leans back to sip tea and watch the world unfold, even as distant memories of hardship and long winters still linger in the hearts of these people. There is a steadfast hope that settles upon them like morning light, promising that the soil will yield, the days will lengthen, and the bonds of family and friendship will grow deeper with each passing season. The rhythm of this colonial life is one of small, enduring motions, of hands that mend and tend and shape, of eyes that lift, often to the skies, and hearts that hold both gratitude and quiet dreams. No one rushes here, for every moment holds its own gentle weight, and every task is attended to with care, whether it is tending a garden bed until the tender green sprouts stretch toward the sun, or hauling up a morning's catch while seabirds wheel overhead and the tide laps the shore. And as the day matures and the light grows brighter, the village hums with an unspoken harmony, a shared understanding that their small world is sustained by these simple, sacred routines, by the enduring strength of the soil beneath their feet, and the ocean at their doorsteps, by the hands of one neighbor reaching to help another. In these quiet colonial days, all of life seems to breathe as one, suspended for a timeless moment in the gentle embrace of morning. Each soul a part of the landscape, each heart attuned to the gentle song of the wind and the water, and every thought, every word, every action guided by the enduring rhythm of a world that is forever beginning anew. Chapter 3: Taxes and Rising Tension. As the days rolled onward and the gentle rhythm of colonial life continued, a quiet change began to stir beneath the surface, something subtle at first, like a distant murmur carried on the wind before it grew into a restless sigh. In the villages and towns where farmers tended their crops and shopkeepers swept their doorways in the golden light of morning, hushed voices started to speak of new burdens that had come across the ocean with the morning tide, new taxes and laws that felt heavier with every passing season, as if someone far away was reaching into their pockets without seeing the calluses on their hands or the worry on their brow. In the lantern-lit taverns and along the wooden docks where crates of fish and barrels of grain were stacked high, men paused in their work to exchange glances and lowered their voices to share complaints that were not meant for every ear, their words like sparks glowing gently in the dark, dangerous in their quiet persistence. They spoke of stamps and duties imposed by people who had never walked their dirt roads or stood with them as they broke the soil under a summer sun, of decisions made in grand halls across the ocean by men who did not know the taste of the salt on these shores, or the scent of rain after a long dry spell. Nighttime gatherings began to take on a new and secretive shape, with candlelight spilling across wooden tables and flickering against tired faces as neighbors spoke of what was fair and what was not, hands gesturing slowly in the soft gloom, each voice hushed but determined, as if they all felt the weight of an invisible tide turning beneath them. Some spoke with fear and caution, knowing that to voice these thoughts loudly could draw harsh eyes and sharp reprisals, but even fear could not extinguish the slow-burning hunger for something better, something freer. They longed not for grand power or glory, but simply for the dignity that comes with standing on one's own ground and feeling that one's labor and one's hopes truly belonged to oneself. Parents rocked sleepy children on their knees and stared into glowing hearths, wondering what kind of world their sons and daughters would inherit if these distant hands continued to close around them like an unyielding grip. The talk was careful and measured, sometimes broken by long silences, filled only with the soft hiss of candle wicks and the creak of wooden beams overhead. Yet these silences were never empty. They were full of thoughts unspoken, of glances exchanged and breaths held just a little too long, as if everyone sensed that they were on the edge of some unknown future. Even as they went about their days mending fences, hauling water, tending to livestock, the sense of unease followed them like a shadow, stretching across the hills, present in every rustle of grain, every splash of water from a wooden bucket, every quiet prayer whispered at dusk. The tension built slowly, invisibly, like distant thunder stirring far beyond the horizon, making its way closer with each decree posted, each penny taken, each liberty overlooked. Mothers and fathers spoke gently to their children at bedtime, promising that they would always do what was right, even if they could not yet see what path that might require them to take. And in the hearts of these ordinary people a resolve began to take shape that was not fiery and loud, but steady and deep, rooted like an old oak in the soil of their everyday struggles. They wished for fairness and for the chance to shape their own destinies. And though they spoke softly in the gathering dark, their hearts burned with a light that could not easily be quenched. The rhythm of the days remained much the same, yet beneath that rhythm was a new and restless current that tugged at their thoughts as they prepared meals and plowed fields, as they folded laundry and mended tools. And each small complaint whispered over mugs of cider or bowls of stew was a thread weaving them closer together, drawing them toward a shared understanding that they could no longer live forever under laws that did not see or hear them, even as they hoped for a gentle path and held fiercely to their simple joys. They began to understand that fairness was something they would have to reach for with their own hands. And as the candle flames bent and danced with every breath of the night, they whispered their hopes and fears into the hushed spaces between them, carrying one another along like leaves swept gently along a slow and certain tide that was rising in the dark. Chapter 4. Boston Tea Party. In the deep hush of a cold December night, Boston Harbor lay wrapped in a strange, expectant stillness, as if the water and the wooden piers themselves had paused to listen to the quiet rhythm of booted feet, moving across planks damp with salt spray and mist. Shadows slipped along the darkened waterfront, lanterns hooded so their light would not dance too boldly upon the waves, and a tense, determined energy ran through every whispered breath as figures gathered near 3 waiting ships at anchor, their hands steady but their hearts thudding in their chests with a mix of fear and resolve. The tide was high and the ships rocked gently, their rigging creaking softly overhead, like the distant sighs of an old forest stirring in its sleep. And for a moment one could hear the faint lapping of water against their wooden hulls, a quiet rhythm that blended seamlessly with the hushed murmurs of men who had decided that this was a night for action, a night to change the course of their lives forever. No shouts were raised, for this was a work that required the careful grace of shadows and secrets, and every face held an expression caught between worry and exhilaration as hands grasped ropes and barrels, and one by one, crates of tea began to move across the decks toward the edge, where the dark ocean waited to receive them, beneath broad-brimmed hats and hastily tied scarves. Eyes gleamed with purpose, and hands moved quickly and surely, and with every wooden crate lifted up and sent over the side, there was the sound of a splash that shattered the quiet, like a heartbeat too loud in a small room. The waves embraced these chests as they hit the surface, and then, disappeared beneath the waterline, swirling into the currents and sinking into a darkness deeper than the night sky. And with each drop, it felt as though a burden was being lightened, a silent message carried out into the ocean that change was stirring, and would not be easily stopped. A breeze brushed across the decks, bringing with it the scent of the salty tide and the faint chill of winter. And those who stood there paused just long enough to feel its touch upon their faces and let it stir their coats and hair, as if it were carrying with it the murmured hopes and fears of an entire town. A breeze threaded with the taste of freedom and uncertainty. The men who moved like spectres on the decks spoke little, their thoughts too full for easy words. But they glanced at one another and nodded as hands reached out to help a neighbor balance the weight of one more crate. As if in that simple gesture they affirmed what they had come here to do together. They were more than scattered strangers tonight. They were one voice in the dark, one will leaning towards something better than what they had known. Even as the crates kept tumbling into the water and the tide pulled them farther and farther from the wooden hulls, a fragile understanding began to grow between those gathered, as though they could feel in their bones that this moment would ripple outward long after these waves had stilled again, that this quiet, daring act would live on in whispered stories and brave hearts long into the years ahead, beneath the broad sweep of starlight across the harbor and the gentle hush of the ocean. Boston slept unaware of all that was unfolding at its doorstep, yet something in the very air felt alive and listening, as if the wind itself would remember this night and breathe. It entered the places it touched, carrying the resolve of those who dared to drop these crates into the dark as a way of saying they would no longer bow to hands that felt too distant and too cold. And when at last the final splash faded into silence and the men moved back along the docks, melting into the quiet streets like mist over the cobblestones, they left behind a harbor forever changed, a breeze forever tinged with the taste of what was yet to come, and the gentle waves forever cradling the weight of their hopes. Chapter 5. Lexington and Concord. In the silvery light of a mist-shrouded morning, before the sun had fully risen, and while a gentle chill still held the air in its quiet hands, a subtle stirring began to ripple across the sleepy villages and green pastures that lay between Lexington and Concord. As if the very earth was holding its breath, dew glistened on the grass like 1,000 tiny jewels, and the soft, damp scent of soil and distant wood smoke drifted along narrow lanes where only the faint rustle of wind in the trees broke the profound hush. In that fragile stillness, beneath an indigo sky already tinged at its edges with the first pink of dawn, there came a sound that did not belong, sharp and fleeting as a sudden gasp, the crack of musket fire that rang out across the open fields and sent birds fluttering upward into the mist. Whispered retellings would one day speak of that morning as a turning point, when an ordinary countryside was forever changed by the echo of those first shots, when sleepy homesteads woke not just to the light of a new day, but to the stirring of a new and uncertain chapter. Farmers paused in the doorways of their barns, hands trembling as they glanced toward the distant road, their breaths catching in their throats as they strained to hear what was unfolding beyond the hills. Mothers pulled their children closer as the sound rolled on the morning air, faint yet unmistakable, stirring something deeper than fear in their hearts, sense that everything they had known was trembling at the edge of transformation. even before they fully understood what had happened. Swift riders began to appear on the winding paths and village streets, their horses' hooves beating a hurried rhythm into the ground as they bent low in their saddles and carried the urgent news from house to house, town to town. Cloaked against the chill, their figures were like shadows flung across the dawn as they shouted into the sleepy silence, their voices urgent yet hushed by the weight of what they carried. The British were marching. Shots had been fired, and all that had been whispered in taverns and around hearths was becoming real in the light of day. Windows flew open as they passed. Lanterns glimmered behind curtains, and a tide of murmured questions and worried glances spread like a ripple across every sleepy face. Along the green pastures and narrow byways, people paused whatever they were doing to listen as the riders disappeared into the mist once more, their message left hanging in the chill morning air, setting hearts to pounding faster and hands to tightening around whatever tools they held, spades or pitchforks or muskets kept close by the door. The countryside was stirring, and its rhythm was different now, quickened by that distant gunfire that spoke of decisions already made and futures already set in motion. No one spoke loudly in those first tense hours. They hardly dared to disturb the fragile light of morning with anything more than quiet resolve and gentle hands upon trembling shoulders, for there was a sense that this was only the beginning of a day that would stretch long and unpredictable before them. Yet beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was also something like a gathering strength, an understanding that they had crossed an unseen threshold together. As mist burned away beneath the strengthening sun and the landscape began to come into focus with all its familiar hills and fields and barns, the sound of distant hoofbeats and hurried breath became part of the morning itself. And in every village green and every farmhouse kitchen, men and women paused to look into one another's eyes with a new seriousness and a newfound determination. The land they loved and the way of life they cherished had shifted forever with those first morning shots. And though they could not see all that lay ahead on the road, winding into the unknown, they felt the chill morning air stirring like a promise, bringing with it a quiet courage that would see them through whatever was to come. Chapter 6. The Siege of Boston. In the gentle dark of a spring evening, as the last light of day bled slowly from the sky and left only a faint lavender glow along the distant hillsides, Boston lay encircled in an almost otherworldly silence. The city held like a fragile vessel cupped in the hands of those who watched and waited beyond its borders. Lanterns glimmered like tiny scattered stars across the slopes surrounding the town, their light trembling faintly against the deep blue of the hills as soldiers moved softly among their campsites, careful not to let their footsteps or voices disturb the hush that had settled over the landscape. Smoke from small campfires rose in twisting ribbons into the darkening air, bearing the scent of dry wood and faint embers, glowing as men sat together in quiet circles, leaning close to one another as they spoke of home and all that they hoped to see again when this long and uncertain chapter was finally behind them. They told stories in low tones, hands resting on knees or wrapped around mugs of warm drink, their eyes reflecting the gentle dance of the firelight as they spoke of distant hillsides and green pastures, of wives who sang lullabies at dusk and children who ran barefoot through summer grass, of fathers and brothers they had left tending familiar fields, of village bells and kitchen fires glowing warmly through frosted windows. Even here, surrounded by shadow and uncertainty, their words carried a gentleness that softened the tense edges of the day, and the sound of their quiet voices wove itself into the night air like a fragile melody, one that could almost make them forget, if only for a little while, the long and tense weeks that had come before, and the days that still stretched ahead. Every so often, someone would glance toward the darkened outline of Boston itself, its windows unlit and its streets strangely empty, and an unspoken understanding would pass between them like a breeze, stirring the branches overhead, for they all knew that this was more than a siege of stone and wood. It was a kind of siege of hearts and histories, a slow tightening that pressed close on all sides and tested the will of everyone who found themselves in its grasp. Lanterns glimmered on ridges and hills as sentries kept their watch, their silhouettes outlined against the broad and patient face of the night sky, and their breaths rose in small clouds that vanished into the cold as they listened to the distant rhythm of the ocean, the distant cries of seabirds, and the occasional muted bark of a dog somewhere across the water. No one spoke loudly, and even the most restless spirits kept their hands busy with simple, familiar tasks, mending a tear in a coat by the light of a flickering candle, or tending the small fire that kept their circle warm, or brushing the dust from a battered musket and rubbing their thumb thoughtfully along its smooth wooden stock. Time seemed to move differently in those hours, as if the siege had slowed the hands of the clock and drawn each moment into a hushed eternity. And so they held close to these small comforts as a way of keeping their fears at bay, their hearts steady against the dark. Occasionally, a burst of laughter would rise from one campfire and then fade gently into the stillness, as someone remembered a childhood mischief or a harvest festival long past, and for a fleeting breath the weariness that had settled into their bones would lift, and they would feel again the lightness of a world that was not bound by blockade or bristling with muskets. It was these stories, told under the sheltering dark of those quiet hillsides, that kept them grounded and hopeful, even as they listened for the distant sounds that might signal another day of hardship ahead. And though they rarely spoke of it aloud, there was a sense shared among them that this patience, this long vigil surrounded by hills and lanterns and sleeping forest, was shaping them into something they had not quite been before, stirring in them a resolve as steady as the hills themselves. Together they sat beneath that deep and endless sky, surrounded by the soft murmur of crickets and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush, lanterns glowing like tiny beacons scattered across the hillsides. Every face turned toward the dark silhouette of Boston, and every heart holding some small, bright spark of anticipation, because they felt that beyond this, still and patient, silent something new was waiting. And when the morning light broke, once more across these hills and valleys they would rise with it, steady and unyielding, ready to shape the days to come. Chapter 7. Declaration of Independence. In the warm hush of a summer evening, as a gentle breeze whispered through the narrow streets outside and the last light of day faded into a dusky blue, a quiet glow filled a small, wood-paneled room where candle flames danced and cast soft, golden light across the faces of the men gathered there, their expressions solemn and intent, as they bent over parchment spread across a long table. The scent of warm wax and ink hung gently in the close air, and each breath they took seemed to carry with it the weight of all they hoped to leave behind and all they wished to build. Hands moved carefully, holding quills that scratched in measured strokes across the waiting pages, and each sound of pen upon paper was a quiet promise stirring into life, a fragile music that spoke of new beginnings and uncharted futures. Around them, lanterns glimmered, like distant stars, and the faint creak of floorboards under restless feet marked the passing of these sacred moments. And although the world outside was hushed and still, inside this room a tide was rising that would reach far beyond those wooden walls. There were whispered consultations as men leaned toward one another, their voices barely audible over the gentle scratch of quills, as they debated each careful phrase, seeking the truest words to give shape to the deep conviction in their hearts. They paused to read aloud passages as they were completed, the sound of those words trembling in the candlelight, gaining strength with each repetition until they began to feel less like ink on a page and more like something living and breathing, a powerful and tender voice that would one day ring across hills and valleys and take root in hearts they had never met. Some paused to gaze into the warm light and let their thoughts drift toward those who had dreamed of this moment long before they themselves had ever put pen to parchment, and others thought of children asleep in distant homes who would awaken into a world forever changed by these quiet, determined strokes of the quill. Every face glowed with the same gentle fire, a shared resolve that was not loud or boastful, but steady and bright as the flame that danced above them. And there was a softness in their eyes as they realized that together they were giving life to an idea that would grow taller than any one of them could have imagined. An idea stitched together from hopes and hardships and the honest labor of ordinary hands. The summer night pressed close against the windows, and far-off crickets began their gentle chorus in the grass outside. And yet inside this room time felt suspended, held in balance between what had been and what was to come. As careful hands guided careful words into existence, one careful letter at a time. Occasionally someone paused to flex a tired wrist or smooth a crinkled edge of parchment, and in these fleeting silences a kind of gentle awe settled over them all, as if they felt the profound weight of their purpose and the fragile beauty of this act they were sharing. There was no thunderous applause, no grand proclamation in these candlelit hours, only a quiet understanding that they were setting into motion something that would speak not only for themselves, but for countless lives that would follow. And they felt that knowledge settle into their bones like a solemn prayer. And when at last the final lines were traced and the quills were set gently aside, the room breathed together in one long, quiet sigh as they gazed upon what they had made, the ink glistening faintly in the light, the words themselves still holding the breath of the hands that wrote them. Outside, the summer breeze shifted gently through the darkened streets and brushed past the windows as if it too wished to carry those immortal words on its quiet wings. And in that sacred stillness, each soul in the room felt a new lightness stirring inside, as though a great door had been opened and a warm current of purpose was already flowing outward into the night, carrying with it a gentle and enduring hope that would never truly fade. Chapter 8: Saratoga and the Turning Point. In the pale light of a mist-veiled morning, when the hills around Saratoga glowed faintly with the first silver touch of dawn, and the damp grass glistened under a sky painted in the softest shades of blue and grey, A hushed expectancy hung over the quiet landscape, as if the very air held its breath and listened to the distant rhythm of drums that echoed slowly across the hills. Soldiers stirred in the chill, rubbing their hands together and stamping softly to chase the cold from their bones, and their breath rose like faint smoke into the morning hush. As they moved through the dewy grass, each careful step soaked with the quiet knowledge that this day would shape the path of all their tomorrows. Footsteps in the damp grass broke the sleepy silence, one by one as they took their places along fences and ridges, the weight of muskets familiar in their hands, and the faint scent of soil and wild herbs rising up from the ground to mix with the mist that wrapped around them like a ghostly cloak. Every sound was softened by that mist. Every face was turned toward the rolling hills as though hoping to catch some secret carried on the breeze, and every heart was beating in time, with a deeper rhythm that none could put into words, a rhythm that felt as old as the hills themselves. Men paused to glance at one another, their eyes meeting in fleeting moments of unspoken understanding, for they knew they were part of something larger than themselves, larger even than the hills that rose dark and gentle against the paling light. And they felt in their bones that this was the day when the tide would turn across the folds of land that surrounded them. Distant drums pulsed like a distant heartbeat in musket. Barrels glinted dully as they caught the grey light, and the sound of voices muffled commands, quiet encouragements. Hurried whispers moved softly through the ranks, like a breeze stirring the meadow grass. And though none spoke of it aloud, a sense of profound change was stirring just beneath the surface, as if the very soil beneath their feet was alive with anticipation, and the mist that kissed their hands and faces was not just water, but a gentle herald of all that was to come. Every soldier felt it as he paused in the gathering light, feeling the damp fabric of his uniform against his skin and the weight of his own breath, as steady and real as the hills that embraced him. And in that moment of shared stillness, they were bound together by a fragile and stubborn hope that they had come too far and given too much to do anything but hold this ground and wait for whatever the morning would bring. The hillsides glowed faintly green beneath the thinning mist, and the sound of the distant drums rolled onward like a tide, and in the hush between each measured beat they could almost hear the stirring of a new chapter, a chapter shaped by their own hands and their own hearts, waiting to be written in the dusk and the dawn of this misty battlefield. Even the animals felt the change, birds winging low across the meadow and deer lifting their heads to gaze across the valley before disappearing, like wraiths into the sheltering trees. And in their absence the silence seemed even deeper, more charged with purpose and more tender with possibility. And so the men stood, breaths slow and eyes fixed upon the hills, as if they might see their futures unfurling like mist across the grass, hands steady despite their fears, and hearts sure despite their weariness, knowing that here in this quiet place where the grass bent under their boots and the sky unfolded slowly into morning, they had reached a turning point they would carry forever in their memories. A moment when something momentous and gentle stirred all around them like the first light of dawn, reaching into every shadow, promising that this was only the beginning of a story that would live long after their own voices had faded into the hills, carried onward by the mist and the distant drums that echoed forever through the morning light. Chapter 9. Valley Forge Winter. In the deep hush of a winter that seemed to stretch forever across the hills and valleys of Valley Forge. A gentle blanket of snow had settled over the forest, its surface soft and pure beneath the silvery moon, and among the dark trunks of trees, their branches hung low under the weight of countless tiny crystals that glimmered faintly in the firelight, like scattered bits of starlight caught in frozen hands. The men gathered close around small campfires that sent fragile columns of smoke drifting upward into the stillness, their breath visible as it unfurled into the chilly air, before vanishing like a whispered thought. And in that quiet landscape they spoke little, for the cold was sharp, and every word was carefully held like a treasure kept close to the chest. Around these fires, shoulders brushed against one another, and hands were warmed over glowing embers. And though their coats were worn thin and their bellies often empty, there was a gentleness in the way they kept close together, as if they could share a little of their strength by simply leaning toward one another and facing the long nights together. Every sound was hushed, as if the forest itself had paused to listen. The faint crackle of wood as flames licked along a branch, the occasional creak of a soldier shifting his weight as he wrapped his blanket tighter, and the soft rhythm of breaths rising into the dark, like small clouds of warmth that glowed for a heartbeat before melting into the starry cold. Beneath the sheltering trees, tents glimmered palely like tired ghosts against the snow, their shapes bending gently in the breeze, and from them came sleepy murmurs and the soft rustle of bodies settling to sleep, hands tucked beneath chins and eyes, closed to dream of gentler places far from these icy hills. Even as they shivered and wished for morning, the men spoke of their homes with a quiet reverence, sharing memories of doorways glowing with firelight, of meals steaming on wooden tables, of loved ones' hands warm upon their own. And as their words wove together, they created a fragile web of hope that glowed faintly between them, like the light of those distant hearths they carried in their hearts. Time moved slowly here, measured not by clocks, but by the gentle rise and fall of tired bodies and the subtle shift of the moon across a sky so clear and sharp it felt close enough to touch. And every morning was greeted not with fanfare but with a sleepy gratitude for having survived another long, cold night. Even their hardships took on a quiet rhythm, like the slow dance of snowflakes spinning down into their hands, and they found comfort in small routines, the careful tending of fires, so they would not fail in the deep hours before dawn, the careful sharing of rations so that no one went hungry alone, the quiet words of encouragement whispered as they wrapped each other's shoulders in whatever warmth they could offer. It was this tender endurance that held them together, as enduring as the forest itself with its deep roots and silent strength. And they began to understand that it was not only grand victories or stirring speeches that sustained them, but the simple, steadfast care they showed one another when the nights felt longest and the stars too distant to count. And though their hands were raw with cold and their eyes were often rimmed with exhaustion, they carried one another forward with gentle patience, and the bonds they forged in that frozen forest would not melt away with the spring thaw, but would remain like deep trails carved into the soil of their hearts. Above them the snow kept falling in slow, graceful drifts, blanketing the world in a softness that blurred the sharp edges of fear and uncertainty. And they embraced the sleepy rhythm of this waiting, listening together to the hush that cradled them, knowing that beyond the long dark nights the light would return, and they would rise together into the promise of morning, their hearts as steadfast as the forest that kept its quiet vigil over them all. Chapter 10. Allies across the sea, beneath a sky scattered with countless stars, and a glowing moon that silvered the restless surface of the ocean. Ships glided slowly across the darkened seas, their sails pale and ghostly in the gentle light, and the only sound was the soft hiss of water, slipping past their wooden hulls, and the occasional murmur of sailors leaning on the rails and looking toward the distant horizon with a quiet sense of wonder and cautious hope. The ocean seemed to breathe around them, rising and falling in slow, steady swells that rocked the decks with a cradle's rhythm and whispered promises to those who kept their long and watchful vigil, as if the very tide carried with it a deep assurance that they were no longer alone in their struggle, and that help was drawing near on the farthest currents of the sea. Lanterns swayed softly from rigging and casting pools of golden light upon tired faces as hands gripped ropes and eyes searched the mist ahead. For every soul aboard was aware of the whispers that had followed them across leagues of ocean, whispers that spoke of a French fleet unfurling its sails in distant harbors, of cannons being loaded and flags raised, of a mighty hand reaching out across the water to answer the call that had been sent so long ago and so far away. The salt breeze carried those hopes like a gentle song, stirring hearts and minds as they gazed into the darkness, feeling their exhaustion ease into a kind of peaceful anticipation that was as vast and deep as the ocean surrounding them. Time moved slowly in this hush, measured only by the creak of the timbers and the rhythmic lap of waves against the keel, and with every breath they took they could taste the ocean's salty kiss and feel the weight of this long voyage lighten as if they were held up by something greater than themselves, something reaching toward them from across the endless blue. Men spoke in quiet tones about what lay ahead, sharing stories of battles fought and hardships endured, their hands clasping one another's shoulders in camaraderie, and their voices filled with the gentle certainty that these ships would find their way to those who waited upon distant shores, bringing with them not only supplies and strength, but also a promise that had traveled across the world, a promise that they had never truly been forgotten. Beneath the sheltering vault of the night sky, their hearts swayed with the ocean, buoyed by the knowledge that they were part of a tide too powerful to turn back. And though the days and nights that had led them to this moment had been long and full of challenge, there was a quiet strength that threaded through every soul upon those decks as they felt the pull of history, moving gently beneath them like the ocean itself. Even the birds that skimmed low across the waves seemed to know that something had shifted in the currents, and that distant lands were drawing closer with every mile. And in the steady rhythm of the swells and the sleepy glow of the lanterns, one could almost believe they could hear the French voices carried across the water, hopeful and steadfast, saying that the dawn would come, and with it the hands and hearts they had longed for. Beneath the pale light and the gently creaking masts, the ocean wrapped them in its slow embrace and carried them onward into the deep blue of a waiting world, while the whispered hopes they had dared to send across the sea at last began to return home, weaving themselves into the waves and the wind and into every quiet breath that held them together as they sailed on toward a new morning neither ocean nor darkness could ever truly delay. Chapter 11. Yorktown and Final Victory. In the grey hush before dawn, when a faint mist still clung to the low hills and hollow valleys around Yorktown, and the damp scent of the river drifted on a gentle breeze. The world seemed to hold its breath as soldiers stood at their posts and watched the light slowly begin to touch the landscape, casting long shadows and a silvery sheen upon the grass wet with dew. Beneath that pale light, the battlefield appeared almost unreal, as if suspended between dream and waking, and then the deep, distant sound of cannons broke the fragile quiet, like distant thunder rolling across an empty sky, stirring men from their thoughts and bringing them back to the tense present, where every heart beat in time with that slow, resonant echo. They had endured so much to reach this morning, had kept their hands steady and their spirits firm through countless nights by firelight and countless days spent leaning into hardship, and now they felt something changing in the very air around them, something quiet and profound that moved through their ranks, like a whispered promise carried by the mist and the breath of the morning wind. No one spoke loudly, for words felt too heavy in that fragile light, and yet every glance exchanged and every quiet gesture was filled with meaning. Hands gripping hands or clasping shoulders as they readied themselves one last time, knowing deep down that this was a turning point, and that soon the long struggle that had shaped them so fiercely would come to its end. The cannons spoke again, their voices mingling with the soft rustle of damp uniforms and the measured sound of boots, sinking into the soil as they advanced. And with each careful step, the mist began to rise and scatter, unveiling the hills and the battered ramparts, where they had fought so hard and so long to gain ground. Somewhere beyond the fog they could hear murmured commands and the scrape of shovels as they dug in, preparing for the final push, and they felt a steady strength stirring in their chests, a quiet assurance that whatever this day held, they would meet it together, their hearts bound as one by all they had survived, and all they hoped would rise from this morning's light. And as the sun began to break free of the distant hills, pouring a gentle glow across the land and setting the fog, too shimmering like spun glass, the cannons roared once more and then fell strangely silent, as if the hills and valleys themselves were listening for the outcome that had been so long in the making. Smoke curled upward into the glowing light, and in that stillness that followed there was a feeling, so deep and quiet it could hardly be named, something like triumph but softer, like relief tempered by the knowledge of all that had been given to reach this moment. The men stood there together as one tide of breath, their faces upturned toward the brightening sky, their tired hands resting lightly on one another's shoulders, and they could feel the gentle weight of what they had achieved settling into them, like the first rays of morning sun warming the chill of a long, cold night, even as they began to understand that this chapter of their struggle was drawing to a close. Their thoughts were gentle and unhurried, filled with quiet gratitude for one another, and for the fragile light that was spreading across the hillsides and touching even the most shadowed places with its tender glow. And though they knew the path that had led them here had been long and steep and strewn with hardships they would carry forever, they also knew that they had held fast to one another as they moved through those dark places together, and that this morning would live in their hearts as a gentle, enduring light, a promise kept, a victory felt more in breath and heartbeat than in shouted cheer, as all around them the mist burned away and the landscape brightened with the gentle truth of a day long wished for and at last begun. Chapter 12. a new dawn of freedom. As the gentle light of morning began to spill softly across hills and rooftops, spreading a warm and golden glow over quiet towns and sleepy villages, the world seemed to breathe more easily, as if the long night that had held it close was at last releasing its gentle grip and allowing the promise of a new dawn to touch every face and every heart that had waited so patiently in the dark. Shadows retreated slowly into doorways and behind trees, and a mist like silver gauze rose from meadows and winding rivers, catching the first rays of sunlight, so that every blade of grass and every gentle ripple on the water shimmered with a quiet brilliance, as though even the most familiar places had been made new by this morning's light. In kitchens and small cottages, hands paused in their work and eyes looked toward the glowing horizon, sensing a quiet shift that went beyond the rhythm of one day ending and another beginning, feeling instead a deeper stirring that spoke of futures unfurling like soft petals and of hopes carried onward like the gentle rise and fall of a steady breath. Birds sang low and sweet from the branches of ancient oaks, their notes weaving together into a melody so peaceful that it settled like a comforting hand upon tired shoulders. And as the light crept further across the hills and into every sleepy hollow, it carried with it a warm reassurance that everything had changed and that these small, steadfast places would never be quite the same again. The people who stirred to greet this light felt lighter too, as if the burdens they had carried for so long had eased into something gentler, something they could hold without fear as they moved into this new day. And with each quiet breath, they felt the slow unfurling of a gentle joy that filled the spaces where worry had been, making room for something softer and more enduring than they had dared to hope before. They moved with care and purpose, hands reaching out to smooth blankets and kindle fires and open windows to let in the morning air, knowing deep down that this was more than the return of the sun, that this light was carrying into every corner of their hearts the sure and tender promise of freedom, reborn and futures rebuilt. Futures they could shape together like potters turning clay in careful hands. Futures built from all they had learned, and all they had dared to believe, when the nights were long and the way ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. Every sound of morning was gentled by that feeling, from the creak of wooden shutters to the distant song of a morning bell. And though the world outside was still hushed and slow to stir, there was a quiet strength in that softness, a sense that the dawn was no longer fragile but steady and kind, a light that could carry them onward one gentle breath at a time. And as they paused to listen to that hush and look into the brightening day, they felt that light settle warmly into them like the first rays upon a tired face, filling them with a profound calm that spoke not only of the trials they had left behind but also of all the gentle tomorrows yet to come, the story they had walked together through hills and harbors and forest. Shadows had brought them here to this gentle morning, and in its softness they could finally lay down every fear and sorrow, allowing themselves to drift peacefully into the quiet light that promised to hold them in its embrace as they moved forward into whatever days and years might rise beyond this shining dawn. And in the hush of that tender sunrise, with their hands clasped and their hearts resting light and easy in their chests, they knew with a gentle certainty that they had come home at last to a future shaped by their own hands and brightened forever by the quiet, steady light of freedom.